Hello, I'm Keith Frankish. Welcome to the sixth and last lecture in this series on the illusionist view of consciousness. This lecture is called Implications of Illusionism. Just to remind you where we are, we started by with an introduction to the illusionist approach to consciousness. Illusionism is the view that consciousness does not involve acquaintance with private mental qualities, qualia, phenomenal properties as they're sometimes called, which are supposed to be private mental versions of the qualities we're aware of in the world around us. One way of putting that is to say that phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist. Phenomenal consciousness being the kind of consciousness that consists in acquaintance with these private mental qualities, the qualities of experience, the what it is likenesses of experience. Our consciousness, the illusionist says, isn't phenomenal consciousness. Then in lecture 2 we looked at some reasons for rejecting the opposite realist view of phenomenal consciousness, the view that phenomenal consciousness does exist, and that consciousness, that our conscious experiences do involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties, with these private mental qualities. Then in lecture 3 we built on this case for illusionism by looking at some positive arguments for adopting the illusionist position, arguments to do with its explanatory power, for example. In lecture 4 we reviewed some objections that are commonly raised to illusionism, and I sketched some responses to those objections. And then in the last lecture we looked at some varieties of illusionism. Illusionism itself is a broad framework for thinking about consciousness, and within that framework many different specific theories could be developed, and we looked at some of the options here, some of the choices that illusionist theorists will have to make as to the shape of their theory. And now in the last lecture I want to look a little beyond illusionism itself to some of its implications. Supposing you accept the illusionism, you think that it's the right way to think about consciousness, well then what follows? What implications does the theory have for issues related to consciousness? For thinking about such things as the consciousness of non-human animals, the possibilities for creating artificial consciousness, and perhaps for ethics. Does illusionism have any ethical implications? Does it change the way we should think about each other and about ourselves? As with the previous lecture, this is relatively unexplored territory, and what I'll be doing here is just sketching some of the questions and making a few suggestions. But this will just be a preliminary discussion, and there's a great deal more work to be done in this area. Okay, so let's begin first of all by just reviewing some of the core implications of illusionism. That this has been implicit in what has been said before. We might think of these as the implications for philosophy of consciousness, the immediate consequences for our philosophical theorizing about consciousness. Okay, so let's begin again by just briefly saying what illusionism is. Illusionism is the view that consciousness does not involve acquaintance with mental qualities. Having a conscious experience of a red apple, say, doesn't involve being acquainted with a private mental redness in addition to the redness of the apple itself. Redness of the apple being a feature of the surface of the apple, disposition to reflect light of certain wavelengths. Having a conscious experience of the apple simply involves being sensitive to that property of the apple, of the surface of the apple, and responding to it in a variety of appropriate ways. It doesn't involve some private mental redness as well as that perceptual sensitivity and all the reactions that it evokes. And insofar as consciousness does seem to involve acquaintance with mental qualities, insofar as phenomenal consciousness does seem to be real, that's an illusion. an introspective illusion due to the way in which our brains model their own activity. And so hence some very straightforward implications of that. First, that we should stop trying to solve the hard problem and the other problems associated with phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness seems to pose all kinds of problems, and problems with which on which philosophers have spent a great deal of time and energy. But if we adopt illusionism, then we should cease to worry about these problems, because they are pseudo problems. If phenomenal consciousness isn't real, then the problems associated with it are not real either. So these problems include explaining what phenomenal properties are they what kind of properties they are they non-physical properties, are they just complex physical properties, are they perhaps fundamental features of reality, and so on. How the brain produces these properties. It seems that these properties are intimately related to activity in the brain. How does the brain actually generate them? That is the hard problem, of course. What kind of epistemic relation we have to these properties? Is it a kind of is it a very special kind of relation, a relation of direct acquaintance, which reveals these properties to us in some unique way, and so on. If we're illusionists, we're going to dismiss these problems, these questions, as pseudo questions. They're questions about something that doesn't really exist. Of course, that doesn't mean we're going to oppose other people investigating these questions. It may be interesting to see where these questions take us, and what sort of answers a realist can give to these questions. But insofar as we're illusionists ourselves, we will regard these lines of inquiry as dead ends. Instead, we should focus on solving what David Chalmers calls the easy problems, the problems explaining all the functions involved in consciousness, all the psychological processes involved in being conscious, the sensitivities and the reactions that are involved in being conscious of something. So, as I say, they're identifying and explaining the informational and reactive processes that constitute perceptual consciousness. Perceptual consciousness being this awareness of the world, awareness of the features of the apple itself, rather than awareness of private mental qualities. And in addition, we should also start trying to solve what I've called the illusion problem. This is the problem of explaining why we think that phenomenal consciousness exists. The illusionist says that phenomenal consciousness is not real. We're not really acquainted with private mental qualities. Nevertheless, it's very tempting, at least with the right kind of philosophical prompting, to think that we are acquainted with such qualities. And we need to explain that. We need to explain why the illusion of phenomenal consciousness seems so compelling. And this comes down really to explaining what Daniel Dennett calls the heterophenomenology, or our reports and judgments about our own consciousness, the way we're inclined to describe our mental lives. And that certainly needs explaining. We don't deny that people are inclined to describe their mental lives as involving acquaintance with private mental qualities. We just don't take those descriptions as infallible. We think they are a distortion or a misrepresentation of what is really occurring, and we seek to explain that. This illusion problem is very similar to what David Chalmers has called the meta problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why we think there's a hard problem. So those are some of the core implications of illusionism. Implications really for the philosophy of consciousness. And in fact, we might think of the message here as being that consciousness doesn't pose a distinctively philosophical problem. It doesn't pose a problem that's different, radically different from the kind of problems that cognitive scientists are used to addressing. So perhaps the take-home message from this is that philosophers should cease to regard consciousness as their own domain. They should hand it over to the cognitive scientists. They might still be involved in working with the cognitive scientists on it as contributors to an ongoing empirical research program, but they should give up the idea that that consciousness poses distinctive philosophical problems, metaphysical, epistemological, explanatory, that are quite different from those posed by other aspects of the mind, or indeed of other biological processes. A little anecdote here. A well-known cognitive psychologist once said to me, there's only one thing we ever really wanted you philosophers to do for us, and that was to explain consciousness. And you haven't done it. Well, of course, he was thinking about the hard problem, the problem of explaining the intrinsic feel of experience, what it is likeness and the phenomenality. And I responded that we are helping with that problem, although maybe not in the way that he was hoping. We're not going to solve that problem, but we may be able to help scientists see that it's not a real problem, that it's a pseudo problem, and one that they needn't worry about. So that's the core implications of illusionism. Let's look now at some of its wider implications. I'll look at implications for neuroscience, for animal consciousness, and for artificial intelligence, and I'll also say something about ethics. In each case, I'll be contrasting the approach that a phenomenal realist takes with the one that an illusionist takes, with the new perspective that an illusionist brings, and I'll be suggesting that the illusionist one is more attractive. Okay, so let's start with some implications for science, for neuroscience in particular. For those neuroscientists who are thinking about consciousness and how to explain consciousness. Well, if you approach the topic from the perspective of phenomenal realism, then you're going to have a problem here, of course, because you're going to run straight up against the hard problem. You're going to encounter an explanatory gap between the kind of things that you, as a neuroscientist, can the sort of processes that you, as a neuroscientist, can describe, and the private intrinsic feel of experience. So what do you do? Well, one thing you can do, and one thing that many scientists aim to do, is to search for what are sometimes called the neural correlates of consciousness. The idea here is that maybe we can't explain how the brain produces phenomenal consciousness, how it produces this private world of mental qualities, but we can at least, the idea goes, identify which brain systems are involved. Okay, so it's widely accepted that phenomenal consciousness depends on the brain, even if we can't explain exactly how the brain produces it. So maybe we can at least identify the bits of the brain that are involved, and that's a step forward. And so we're searching for the correlates of consciousness rather than the explanatory mechanisms, if you like. The ones we're searching for the brain states that go along with consciousness, even if we can't really explain the relation between them and consciousness. Now, there's there's a bit of work to do in making this notion of a neural correlate more precise. But it's roughly the notion of the specific brain systems that are sufficient for the presence of phenomenal consciousness generally, or for a specific phenomenally conscious experience. We can talk about the correlates of a consciousness in general or of a specific conscious experience. That's sufficient given the background of all the other brain processes that are necessary for normal functioning. So really, we're looking for those bits of the brain that are active when you're having a conscious experience, and that are not active or less active the rest of the time. And there are various ways of trying to do this. One is to use brain imaging, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. So you put the subject in the scanner, and the scanner images blood flow within the brain. More specifically, I think oxygen content, which is assumed to correspond with activity. So where there's more blood flow, there's more activity. So you put a person in a scanner, you get them to have various conscious experiences, you present them with various stimuli, and then you see where there's increased activity in the brain, where the scanner shows increased activity in the brain. Another technique is transcranial magnetic stimulation. This involves using electromagnets placed close to the subject's head to induce an electric current within a targeted region of their brain, and this is harmless, relatively harmless, and then we see what effects this has when you stimulate particular regions. What effects does that have on their consciousness? Do they suddenly have, perhaps if we stimulate a certain region of the visual cortex, do they suddenly have see a flash of colour, experience a flash of colour? Or perhaps if we stimulate another region, they experience the smell of fried onions, perhaps, and so on. Or perhaps we can, if they're already perceiving something, inducing a current in this region will interfere with their perception, so they will temporarily become blind, perhaps. So again, we can establish correlations between what's happening, the activity in certain regions of the brain, and what the subject is experiencing. There was a lot of work on this within this field, and there's a little survey paper there from 2016 summarising some of it. Okay, so that seems clear enough then, that we're trying to find the neural subsystems, the brain systems that are correlated with, perhaps that produce phenomenal consciousness or specific phenomenally conscious experiences. That there is a problem, a methodological problem for this research program, and it's simply this: that phenomenal consciousness is private. The experimenter, the scientist, wants to establish correlation between brain activity and conscious states, but they have no direct access to the subject's conscious states. They can only observe one of the two things they're trying to correlate. Only the subject really knows what they're experiencing. So you may say, well, why is that a problem? The subject can tell the experimenter what they're experiencing, or they can react in other ways that indicate what they're experiencing. Well, yes. But then really what the experimenter is doing is establishing correlations between brain activity and certain reactions on the part of the subject. These reactions might be intentional, they're deliberate. The subject might report what they're experiencing, might say, I suddenly experience the smell of fried onions. Or they might press a button to indicate that they've seen a stimulus, that they're aware of a stimulus. Or they might be unintentional, automatic reactions like eye movements and pupil dilation. Again, we might take those to be signs that they are reliable indications that they have consciously experienced the stimulus. But these reactions of different kinds, these are the only data that the experimenter has to correlate with brain activity. And now there's a problem, because maybe the brain activity that we're detecting isn't really necessary for the conscious experience itself, but just for these reactions that go with it. There are certainly going to be brain processes involved in producing the reactions, and how can we tell which, and how can we separate out the brain processes that go with the reactions and the ones that go with the experience itself? Suppose we identify a certain region of the visual cortex that looks like a plausible candidate for the neural correlate of conscious visual experience. We do this on the basis of brain scans, let's suppose. And then we test that using transcranial magnetic stimulation. So we see what happens when we disrupt activity in that region of the brain. Does the subject still react as if they're having a conscious visual experience? Let's suppose that we ask them to look at an image and to press a button to say to indicate that they can see it, and then we disrupt the activity in this region with the electromagnetic coils, and let's suppose they don't press the button, indicating that they're not having a conscious visual experience. So it seems that this would seem to confirm that activity in that region is crucial for conscious visual experience. Well, yes, maybe, but there's another possibility. Maybe activity in that region is crucial not for visual experience itself, but for reacting to one's visual experience. Maybe if you interfere with that region, with the magnetic stimulation, then the subject can no longer react to the experience, can't tell you that they're having it, can't press the button, but they're still having it. How could we tell? Well, you might think, okay, still couldn't we settle this by talking to the subject? I suppose once the experiment's over, we say to the subject, look, in the middle of that experiment there, we were asking you to press the button to indicate whether or not you could see the image. Now, there was a period there where you didn't press the button. Was that because you genuinely couldn't see the image, or was it that you were somehow felt paralyzed and were unable to move your fingers, but you were still actually seeing the image? And suppose the subject says, no, I wasn't paralyzed or anything. I couldn't see anything. I genuinely couldn't see the image. So that would seem to confirm our hypothesis that this brain region is involved in generating the conscious experience itself, not just the reactions. But there's another possibility. Maybe that brain region is crucial for forming memories of our experiences. So in disrupting that region, we didn't merely inhibit the reactions that the subject would otherwise have produced, but we also inhibited the formation of any memories that would have gone along with with their experience. But the experience itself was still there. So there was still the qualia, still the show in the Cartesian theatre, if you like, but the subject was unable to react to this show in any way at all, and couldn't even form memories of it. So naturally, when we asked them later, they said they hadn't had any experience. There hadn't been any inner show then, but there was all the same. And so long as we think of consciousness in terms of this presentation of some inner quality, that seems to be a possibility. It seems that we could uh, uh, the inequality could continue to be presented while all the reactions were suppressed. And so how do we know then when we're when we're tracking brain processes that go along with the experience, we're not merely tracking the ones that go along with the reactions to the experience? So yes, these 2 points just summarize that. The subject's memories could be fallible too, and the activity that we've detected is required to form memories of the experience rather than for the experience itself. You remember this was a major theme in Lecture 2, where Dennett's attack on qualia, that we can't pull apart the supposed feel itself, the mental quality, from all the reactions to it. And this is a similar problem that we're encountering here in trying to look for the neural correlates of the feel. That how can we be sure we're tracking those rather than any of the reactions? How can we be sure indeed that there is anything other than the reactions? So then we have a problem here in that how can an experimenter establish correlations between the things they can observe, the objective patterns of activity in the brain, and the private subjective states of consciousness? Now, when I put this objection to phenomenal realists, one response I often get is that the solution would be for the experimenter to do the experiment on themselves. So to make themselves the person in the scanner, or the person who's having the magnetic stimulation. And then the experimenter will be able to observe both sides. They'll be able to see, if they can see the readouts from the scanner, they can observe those, and they'll also, from the first person perspective, be able to observe what effects it's having, what conscious states they're in. So now they will be able to observe both sides of the correlation. So as I say, maybe the subject could notice the correlations for themselves while they're actually in a scanner. But I think there's still a problem with this, however, because look, let's imagine it's like this: the experimenter is lying in the scanner, and let's suppose there's a screen over the head on which different images are being flashed. Let's say different colours. So there's a red. The screen goes red, and then it goes yellow and green, and so on. And there's also another screen, let's suppose, showing the scanner's image of what's happening in their brain. And the experimenter now can notice correlations between what they're experiencing. They're having a red experience because there's a red patch being flashed onto the first screen, so they're having a red experience, and what's happening in the what's being shown in the scanner's image, and they can notice correlations between the two, between what what experiences they're having and what areas of their brain are active. But the trouble with this, I think, is that, again, even from the first person perspective, we can't really get beyond reactions, because the experimenter, even though they're introspecting, they still have to react to their experience. They have to notice that they are having a certain experience. They have to notice that they are having an experience of red, say, and then see how that goes, what brain activity that corresponds to. If they're just kind of lying there and these experiences are just happening without their taking any notice of them, as it were, without their reacting anyway, then they won't be able to make any correlations. They need to react in some way to the experience in order to register the correlation with what's being recorded by the scanner. If they simply lie there passively, letting the experiences happen without taking any notice of them, then they themselves don't have any data to correlate with the data from the imaging data. So even in the first person case, you're still, as it were, the prisoner of your reactions. Even if you do have some kind of primitive mental acquaintance with the quality of your experience, in order for that to play any role in your thinking about the experience, in your theorizing about the experience, in your correlating that experience with something else, there have to be further psychological reactions. I mean, let's suppose that there really is some inner quality of reddishness, the feel of the experience that I'm having. A show presented in the theatre, as it were. Still, I've got to react to that show. Unless I notice that quality, unless I react to it in some way, well, it's idle. It has no effect on the rest of my psychology, on the rest of my psychological processes, on my own thinking about what's happening to me. And again, the activity that I observe when I'm in this state might be the activity that supports that reaction, that noticing the experience, that noticing of the quality of the experience, rather than with the quality of the experience itself. So even in the first person case, I can't separate out my reactions from the experience in the way that I would need to be able to do in order to identify the neural correlates of the pure experience itself. Maybe the neural correlate of the experience itself is just a single neuron firing, and all the rest is reactions. All the rest of the activity is involved in generating reactions. It's untestable, because there's no way of tracking the pure quality of the experience independently of the reactions, even from a first person perspective. All we can really find are the neural correlates of specific reactions associated with consciousness, not with consciousness itself, in the phenomenal sense. So the moral of all that is that if you want to draw conclusions about the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness itself, then you're going to have to make assumptions about the correlation between certain reactions and phenomenal consciousness. You can detect the neural correlates of various reactions associated with phenomenal consciousness, but you're going to have to make assumptions about how those reactions are correlated with phenomenal consciousness itself. And how do you test those assumptions? For all the reasons we've just seen, you can't directly test correlations between things you can observe, whether it's brain activity or reactions, and phenomenal consciousness itself. The same problem arises. Now the problem is, how do we correlate reactions with phenomenal consciousness? Before we were trying to correlate neural activity with phenomenal consciousness, and we've seen that all we can really do is correlate neural activity with reactions associated with phenomenal consciousness. Okay, so then how do we correlate the reactions with phenomenal consciousness? All the same problems arise, because the reactions are things that the experimenter can observe. Phenomenal consciousness is not something they can observe. And even from a first person perspective, we still have a problem here, because my beliefs about my own phenomenal states, my judgments about them, my reactions to them, anything that I might record and use as data in this investigation, they are all reactions. How do I sort of penetrate through to the pure experience and somehow register and record that in order to correlate it with my own reactions? Again, I can't do it, because any attempt to register the experience itself, the pure feel of the experience, is some kind of reaction. I can't, as it were, get out of the prison of my own reactions and directly compare them with and directly correlate them with the experience itself. So we're kind of stuck. Now you might You might object at this point, and people have when I've raised these the concerns, people have objected that, well, why is this a special problem for consciousness? Isn't it the case that all the time scientists are making claims about things that they can't observe? They're claiming to detect black holes and dark matter and subatomic particles and so on. None of these things are things that they can directly observe. What they can observe are the indications on their instruments, and so on, the images generated by telescopes and electron microscopes and particle accelerators and so on. They're just seeing the outputs of these things. They're not actually seeing the quarks and the bosons and the black holes and themselves. Well, yes, that's true. But there's an important difference here. These unobservable entities in other areas of science, they have the status of something like theoretical posits or hypotheses. We infer the existence of these things to explain the observations that we make, the data that our instruments gather and so on. Or else, in the case of black holes, for example, they're entities whose existence is implied by our physical theories. The point is, in each case, we have some train of inference that leads us from the things we observe to the things that we can't directly observe, to the unobservables, either through physical theory, say, or through an inference to the best explanation of the things that we're observing. And phenomenal properties are not supposed to be anything like that. It's not the case that we posit phenomenal consciousness to explain our reactions. As we've seen in previous lectures, it as an explanatory notion, phenomenal consciousness is pretty useless. We seem to be able to explain all our reactions without mentioning phenomenal consciousness. That's one of the big problems with the notion. So it's not a theoretical posit in that sense, and nor can we infer its existence by some mathematical process from other theories that we have, from physical theories or biological theories or whatever. No, it's supposed to be something that we directly observe. That's the whole point of it. It is supposed to be a direct observable, perhaps the only, according to our idealists, it's the only thing we directly observe. So there's a disanalogy with unobservables in other areas of science. This phenomenality is supposed to be something that's observable. It's just observable only from a very particular first-person perspective. And even in that case, it's hard to get a grip on the pure thing in itself, separate from all the psychological reactions associated with it. It's hard to get a grip on the pure feel of pain separately from all the pain reactions. That again is Dennett's theme in his attack on qualia. So what I'm inclined to conclude from that is that the search for the neural correlates of phenomenal consciousness is a wild goose chase. It's a search for a will-o'-the-wisp, an indefinable essence. It's like searching for the vital spirit, the spark of life. In the past, it seemed quite plausible to people to think that there must be some special force that animated living things and distinguished them from dead, from non-living things, from inorganic things. But trying to search for the biological correlates of that vital force would have been an unproductive program, because really all that's there are complex kinds of physical processes of the kind that can also occur in non-living things. There's nothing. There's no special essence to organic chemistry that distinguishes it from inorganic chemistry, and I think this is a situation with the search for the neural correlates. And of course, this is exactly the perspective that illusionism provides. Now here's an MRI image of my own brain, actually, at least as it was a few years ago. I may perhaps have deteriorated somewhat since those days. Anyway, here's what the illusionist says. Here's what the illusionist will say about this search for the neural correlates of consciousness. They'll say we should stop doing it. We should stop trying to look for the neural processes that correlate with the mental qualities of experience, since there are no such qualities. Instead, we should search for the neural processes that explain specific responses associated with experience, either with specific experiences or with conscious experience in general, or with specific types of conscious experience, visual experience, or auditory experience, and so on. So the two key differences here are that we focus on responses and reactions, not just behavioral ones, but physiological ones, psychological ones of various kinds that are associated with experience, rather than focusing on the supposed pure quality of the experience. And we search for explanations. We search for the neural processes that explain these responses, rather than just on looking for ones that correlate with them. Where there's no hard problem of explaining responses and reactions, and so we can set out to look for explanations of them, to find the mechanisms that produce them, the neural mechanisms that produce them. And of course, among these responses that we seek to explain will be our introspective reports and judgments about the nature of our experiences themselves. So we will search for the neural mechanisms that explain those too, thereby addressing the illusion problem. And another aspect of this change of perspective, I think, is that we should stop thinking of experiences as discrete, unified phenomena. I'm not sure everyone who searches for the neural correlates of consciousness does this, but I think it's tempting, because it's tempting to think of what's the neural correlate of that particular experience, where we describe the experience in phenomenal terms, the feel of seeing yellow, of smelling coffee, of having a pain in one's toe or whatever. It's tempting to think that this phenomenal vocabulary picks out some discrete phenomenon that we might then expect to have a unified neural basis. But one thing that we see in looking at the problems for this program of looking for the neural correlates is that experiences aren't really like that. They're actually a cluster. Each experience is a cluster of different kinds of reactions. Again, remember Dennett's talk about multiple drafts. Experience isn't just involves in constructing an experience. The brain isn't constructing a single unified event that is displayed for consciousness. It's doing it's making lots and lots of different kinds of discriminations at the same time, all of which are producing different reactions. So it's a much more diverse process. So accordingly, we should start thinking of experiences as clusters of reactions, each of which we can detect, each of which perhaps we detect in different ways, and each of which may be produced by a different neural subsystem. So to ask what's the neural correlate of this experience of pain it gives a misleading sense of that there's a single target of investigation. We should ask what is the cluster of reactions that are involved in this experience of pain, and which neural subsystems were involved in producing them. Okay, so that's one way in which adopting an illusionist perspective might affect the way that scientists approach the study of consciousness. There are other ways too, of course, and there are many more complexities to this particular one. But I think that gives a flavour of how of how illusionism may affect the sort of questions that scientists ask and the experimental approaches that they take. I should say that I think a lot of the work that has been done under the banner of searching for the neural correlates of consciousness can be reinterpreted from an illusionist perspective. I'm not suggesting that all that work was wasted, not at all. But we need to look at it from a different perspective, as mapping, as identifying neural processes, neural mechanisms responsible for particular reactions, rather than as indications of the neural processes that generate this private world of phenomenality. So it's not a matter of throwing out all that and starting again. It's a matter of reinterpreting, I think, a lot of the data that we already have. Okay, let's move on now and look at another area: artificial intelligence implications for AI. Again, this is going to be very sketchy and brief, but it will give you a flavour, I think. Here's a question: could we create consciousness artificially? I think that's a question a lot of people have asked, and it's certainly a very interesting question. But I think it's a question that is difficult, if not impossible, to answer if we are phenomenal realists. So why is that? Why is it difficult to answer this question if we're phenomenal realists? Well, we've already seen the answer really right back in lecture 1, and it's this. In order to design a machine, we need to do, putting it very, very simply, we need to do two things. First of all, we need to provide a description of what we want the machine to do. So if we want to design a television set, for example, the description is going to be something like this. The machine must detect radio signals if it's an analog television, and then it must use the information in those signals to control what appears on a screen, control the pattern of light and shade and colour on a screen in such a way that the image encoded in the signal is reproduced on the screen. Or just take a very simple example. If you want to create a pair of scissors, then the description is that it's got to be some handheld device which can be used for cutting paper and cardboard and so on. So we need a description of what we want the thing to do. And then, secondly, of course, we need to design a machine that does that, that does that performs the functions specified in the description. And this will probably involved designing subsystems, component systems that perform tasks which collectively implement the task specified in the description. So in the case of the television, we'll need to have subcomponents that detect radio signals and that extract the information in those signals, and then use that information to control what appears on a screen, and so on. And why is that a problem for artificial consciousness? Well, it's not a problem for artificial intelligence generally. Here's an example of a robot, Kismet, designed by Cynthia Brazil. This robot was designed to detect emotions in humans. It was designed to be sensitive to certain features of human faces that are indicative of emotions, the smiling, the narrowing of the eyes or whatever, widening of the eyes and so on. And then to be able to respond by making similar facial expressions itself. So it can detect when someone appears to be smiling at it, and then it can smile itself. It can move its eyes and lips and so on in a way that indicates smiling. So it's at least giving the appearance of being socially intelligent, of interacting with people through social signals of emotion and so on. So that's not a general. This isn't a general problem for AI. In fact, this is exactly how AI works. But this is a problem for trying to design artificial consciousness, artificial phenomenal consciousness. Okay, and the problem here is obvious. Really, it's that qualitative properties, a phenomenal consciousness, can't be characterized in functional terms. That's the whole point of making a distinction between the hard problem and the easy problem. The distinction between the pure feel of experience and the functions associated with experience. The aim here isn't to create a machine that does certain things, that reacts in certain ways, that performs certain functions. It's to create a machine that just feels a certain way privately on the inside. And that's not a functional description. And that if we can't characterize consciousness in functional terms, then we can't design a machine to produce it. We just there's no target for us, for the designer. We say to the designer, we need you to design something that feels a certain way. How do you do that? So we seem to hit a dead end here. We have no, insofar as we have a specification of what we're trying to do, to build a creature that is phenomenally conscious, it's not one that we can set out to meet. We can set out to meet a functional specification, to produce a machine that does certain things. But how do you set out to produce a machine that just feels internally, privately a certain way? So this is an analogue of the hard problem. Whereas the hard problem is a problem of explanation, this is a problem of construction, and it's the problem of constructing phenomenal consciousness is uniquely hard. Unlike all other projects in AI, it's a problem that's we just can't see how to set about. And so I've called it the hard project, my analogy with the hard problem. And again, the only way we could make progress on this is by making assumptions about the functions that are sufficient for phenomenal consciousness. We might assume that if a robot can make certain kinds of perceptual discriminations and then use that information to control its behavior in certain ways and so on, and then do this in a sufficiently rich and sophisticated way, then it will be phenomenally conscious. So if we have a robot that can that is sensitive to colors, has color video cameras, and it can take the information from these cameras and use it to produce finely tuned responses to things of different colors. It can distinguish different shades of colors, and it can say which colors are more like each other, and then it can use this information, its color information, to control its behavior in all sorts of very subtle ways, and pretty much as we do. Then we might say, okay, we'll assume that's sufficient for phenomenal consciousness. And who knows, we might be right, but how do we tell? How do we know? Suppose we create a robot that performs all the functions associated with human consciousness. So it's as sensitive as we are to the features of the world around it, and it uses information supplied by its sensors to control its reactions in the rich variety of ways that we do. So it can make these discriminations among colours. It can discriminate among different smells and sounds and so on. And all of these, each of these discriminations has a rich impact on its behaviour. Maybe it can taste a glass of wine, and it can not only make lots of discriminations, but it can classify these discriminations and make comparisons between them, and make associations between tastes and other experiences, and it can say that this wine reminds it of summer or whatever, and so on. And it responds in all the rich variety of ways that we do. So it reacts as if it's conscious, just like us. Including saying that it's conscious, and indeed believing that it's conscious, and perhaps even believing that its experiences have mysterious qualitative properties, like as ours seem to have. So it issues reports on its own experiences, introspective reports on its own experiences that are very similar to ours. It's indistinguishable from ours, let us say, in terms of its reactions. But we still couldn't be sure that it was conscious in the phenomenal sense. We still couldn't be sure that the inner lights were on, as it were. Maybe all we've created is a perfect zombie. Maybe reproducing all of those reactions isn't sufficient to switch on the inner lights. Maybe there's some peculiar feature of the human brain, of its biological constitution, that is necessary for phenomenal consciousness. Maybe something made of different materials wouldn't cause those inner lights to come on. How could we tell that? Again, phenomenal consciousness is private. So again, it seems that these realist assumptions here just lead us into a dead end. We can press on with the easy projects, with the projects of creating robots that display all kinds of reactions associated with consciousness. But we've no clue how to start on the project of creating artificial phenomenal consciousness, and we couldn't tell if we'd succeeded anyway. This isn't to say, of course, that we couldn't do it. Maybe in building a robot that performed many of the functions associated with human consciousness, or maybe in creating artificial versions of human brain systems, we would, incidentally, as a side effect, create phenomenal consciousness. But we couldn't be sure we'd done it. So at best, we would succeed by accident, and couldn't be sure that we had succeeded. Okay, so again, the illusionist perspective here, I think, is a more attractive one. It tells us to forget this hard project of trying to create distinctively phenomenal consciousness, because there's no such thing. They're trying to create this qualitative essence of experience. And we should instead focus on the easy project of creating perceptual consciousness, of creating robots that are finely sensitive to significant features of their environment, and which display an appropriate range of responses to those features. Of course, the words significant and appropriate here are going to be relative to the AI's purpose, to what kind of things we want it to do, what kind of environments we want it to inhabit, and so on. I mean, in our own case, natural selection has designed us to be sensitive to features that are important for our survival, and to display responses that help to promote our fitness. And unless we want AIs to be exact duplicates of us, we will equip them with different sets of priorities and different sorts of sensitivities and reactions. So designing artificial perceptual consciousness is not exactly an easy project, but it's not an impossibly hard one either. We can provide a functional specification of what perceptual consciousness involves, and we can start experimenting in designing mechanisms that meet that specification. And moreover, there's no special problem in deciding when determining whether we've succeeded. We've succeeded if our robot does display the right range of sensitivities and reactions, and we can observe all that. Okay, so that's perceptual consciousness. In terms of the diagram we've been using throughout, that's the first of these two loops. It's sensitivity to the to features of the world and appropriate reactions to them. What about introspective consciousness, this higher order awareness, which I suggested is what's responsible for the illusion of phenomenal consciousness? Could we create AIs that have that and consequently have the illusion of being phenomenally conscious, as we do? Well, yes, surely we could, because it's just a matter of building in more sensitivities and dispositions to react. A new level of sensitivity and reaction, this time directed on the machine's own, on the robot's own first-order perceptual sensitivities and the reactions that they produce. So we need to make the machine sensitive to its own perceptual states and to the reactions that those perceptual states generate, and then have a bunch of reactions to them. So it detects what perceptual and reactive state it's in and reacts to that. Perhaps by forming beliefs and memories and making reports and using this information for all kinds of higher level control purposes. And all this can be specified in functional terms. And then the task is simply to create introspective mechanisms that perform those functions. Again, not a especially easy task, but again, not an impossibly hard one. So yes, I think we could design creatures that have the sense of being phenomenally conscious, and we could design it in. It's a feasible project to design in the sense of phenomenal consciousness. And note that this is quite different from creating phenomenal consciousness itself. There we have no sense how to do it, and we couldn't tell if we'd succeeded. At best, we might succeed accidentally without knowing that we had. So we would always have this puzzle. We've created these creatures, but are they phenomenally conscious? Are the lights on inside? And one could imagine all kinds of ethical worries arising from that. But once we adopt the illusionist perspective, it's not like that at all. When we focus on the sense of being phenomenally conscious, the illusion of being phenomenally conscious, then that's something we can specifically design in. So there would be no dispute about whether our AIs have it or not. If we hadn't designed in any introspective mechanisms, then they wouldn't have it. And if we designed in the right kind of ones that produce the right sort of reactions, then they would. Of course, that's assuming that we would actually set out to create the illusion of phenomenal consciousness, that we tried to design it in because it's a feature we wanted our AIs to have. But of course, we might not want to do that. It depends on whether we think it would be useful for our AIs to have that sense, to have the sense of being phenomenally conscious. Would it be useful would it help them to do the kind of things that we want them to do? Would it be helpful for them for their own well-being to have it? You may remember that I've referred at various points to Nicholas Humphrey's work on phenomenal consciousness, and his suggestion that the illusion of phenomenal consciousness is a highly adaptive one that gives in our case, natural selection selected for introspective mechanisms that produce it, precisely because it gives us it enriches our existence and makes us more tenacious of life and improves our fitness, enhances our fitness. So we might want to give AIs the sense of being phenomenally conscious for the same reason, to make them more to enrich their lives and make them more determined to hold on to life and to persevere and to enjoy themselves. We might find we might think that this sense is important for them to flourish as artificial persons. But even if we don't set out to deliberately create the sense of a phenomenal consciousness in our AIs, we might install mechanisms that give them that sense anyway. I mean, we probably would want to give them introspective mechanisms of some kind so that they can monitor their own perceptual states and their own reactive states. And this might just, as a natural consequence of this, they might start to conceive of themselves as having a private inner world. And perhaps if they start doing philosophy, then they might begin to puzzle over the hard problem and so on. So I think it's quite likely that AIs that some AIs at least will have the sense of being phenomenally conscious, either because we've deliberately set out to create that impression, or because we've given them introspective mechanisms that have the consequence that they develop this sense. But either way, there will be no deep mystery here about artificial consciousness. All the facts are available to us. They're facts about the nature of the perceptual and first-order perceptual and reactive states that constitute perceptual consciousness, and about the introspective sensitivities and reactions that constitute introspective consciousness. These systems will be incredibly complex, and it will be difficult to predict their behaviour in detail, but we should have a pretty good idea of what kind of introspective reports they will make, what they will say about their own internal states, how they will describe their inner lives, whether they will be puzzled by the apparent phenomenal qualities of their experiences and so on. And there'll be nothing deeply hidden from us. There'll be no further mystery of whether some inner light is on or off, as indeed there isn't in our own case. So that's another example of how adopting an illusionist perspective removes a conceptual obstacle to thinking about consciousness, in this case to thinking about creating artificial consciousness. Let's move on now to another topic closely related, thinking about animal consciousness, consciousness of non-human animals. So are other animals conscious? Are they conscious in the way we are? Does this creature here feel pain in the way that we do? Again, these questions present a problem for realist theories, for those who approach them from the perspective of phenomenal realism. And the problem, of course, is this: how can we tell which creatures are phenomenally conscious? Are the inner lights on? Thomas Nagel famously asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" And he argued that we can never know, because their bat experiences are so different from our own that we can't extrapolate from our own experiences to theirs, and nothing we can know about their biology, their physiology, their brain processes can tell us what it is like for them. Again, the phenomenology is private. So this fish here is, I guess, reacting as if it's in pain, but is it really actually feeling pain? What is fish pain like? Is it like anything, or is it just a kind of zombie pain? Now, of course, there's a lot we can do here. We can map a creature's reactions. How does it react when it's injured, for example? And we can identify the brain processes that support these reactions, and we can learn all about this in the finest detail. And we can also consider how similar other creatures are to ourselves, and how similar their reactions and are to ours, and how similar their brain structures are to ours. But the problem, of course, is how we move from that information to a conclusion about phenomenal consciousness. How do we know which reactions and which brain processes are crucial for phenomenal consciousness itself? How do we know which similarities with ourselves are the relevant ones? Somehow we have phenomenal consciousness, let's suppose, if we're realists, and that's due to something about us. But what exactly? This is the problem that we discussed earlier in talking about the neural correlates of consciousness. We saw that it's impossible to pin down the precise correlates of the field of experience itself, as opposed to the correlates of the reactions associated with pain, say. And if we can't do that, then we can't ask whether other creatures have those correlates or not. If we can't identify them in ourselves, then we can't say whether other creatures have them or not. So, again, the only way we can draw any conclusion about phenomenal consciousness in other animals is by assuming a correlation between certain objective features, either reactions or brain processes or whatever, and the subjective phenomenality itself. And we can't test those assumptions. So again, we seem to have a dead end. Here's the fish on the end of the hook, and it's displaying behavior that is certainly pain-like pain behavior, and maybe it has brain structures similar to those that cause pain behavior in us, but is it really pain in the phenomenal sense? Is there really that essence of the qualitative essence of pain? Is it present there? This question is unanswerable. This is a reading here, a useful reading, a report on consciousness and its implications for ethics, for ethical treatment of other animals, which I recommend to you, by Luc Mühlhauser. And another, I think, rather strange implication of phenomenal realism when it comes to thinking about the consciousness of other animals is that there's going to be a sharp division in the animal world, in the natural world, between those creatures that are phenomenally conscious and those that aren't. And this is going to be quite sharp, because it looks like a binary matter, a yes-no matter. Either there is something it's like to be that creature, it does have a world of phenomenal qualities, or it doesn't. I mean, there may be a lot of variation in the nature of the phenomenal properties that an animal and different animals have, but whether it has an inner world of phenomenality or not seems to be an on-off thing. Either the inner lights are on and there is some kind of phenomenality, there is something it's like to be the creature, or the inner lights are off and there's nothing it's like to be the creature. And so it seems that there's going to be this sharp division, both in among present-day animals and also, I guess, in evolutionary terms. At some point in evolution, the inner lights must have come on, it seems. And this seems to me quite an unattractive and implausible picture of the natural world. From an evolutionary perspective, we know that evolution operates by small incremental changes over long periods of time. This suggests a sudden change between non-conscious creatures and conscious ones, and this change would have been a huge one. I mean, phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be a very important feature, right? And so you suddenly go from creatures that don't have it to creatures that do have it. And also, of course, it seems it has some strange, some unattractive, I think, ethical consequences. That there's a line you can draw between those creatures that have an inner life, and I guess whose experiences matter, and those that don't have an inner life, that are just biological robots, as it were, that are just biological machines, and whose inner life and whose condition doesn't matter to us. Moreover, we don't know where to place that line. So are fish on one side of it or the other side of it? Do fish matter or not matter? We're in this strange position of supposing that there's a hugely important distinction here, a hugely important ethical distinction, we might think, which we can't locate. So it really matters whether or not a creature is phenomenally conscious, phenomenal realists say, but we can't know which ones are and which ones aren't. This is an odd, I think, view of the natural world. So again, let's come to the illusionist perspective, which I'm of course going to suggest is more attractive. The crucial point, of course, is that there are no private phenomenal facts. There's no question of an inner light being on or off. All there are public facts, publicly accessible facts about informational and reactive complexity, about the nature of the creature's sensitivities and the reactions that those sensitivities produce. Not a matter of an inner light being on or off, but of increasingly complex informational and reactive processes. So there is nothing deeply hidden from us here. It's just a matter of doing the science and finding out what sensitivities and reactive dispositions different animals have, and how similar and different they are to our own. And in terms of dividing creatures into conscious and non-conscious, there is no sharp dividing line. It's no matter of an inner light being on or off, metaphorically speaking, of course. It's just a matter of creatures having increasingly complex informational reactive processes, increasingly complex forms of perceptual consciousness. And indeed, not just a matter of increasing complexity, but of increasing diversity of informational and reactive processes, different, perhaps equally complex, but different patterns of sensitivity and reaction. And we can map all these in as much detail as we care to go. So there's no sharp division of our fellow creatures into the phenomenally conscious sheep and the zombie goats. Rather, there are just complex sets of similarities and differences between us and other animals in our informational capacities and reactive dispositions. So when we look at the fish here, what we should be asking is not is there in there somehow a private world of phenomenal pain? We should be asking what kind of sensitivities does this creature have to bodily damage and disruption, and what sort of psychological and physiological and behavioural reactions do those sensitivities produce? And similarly, if we ask the further question of whether this creature's condition should matter to us, we shouldn't try to answer that by asking whether there is phenomenal pain somehow present in the creature's psyche. We should try to answer it by considering whether the pattern of sensitivities and reactions that the creature displays is one that matters to us. And how we answer that question is a matter, I think, that we need to discuss. What kinds of sensitivities, what kinds of reactive dispositions matter to us? Do they only matter if they're significantly similar to our own? or do we have some other way of evaluating these things? But the point is, we need to focus on what's actually there, rather than some elusive essence. I think it's a big mistake to locate the source of ethical value in something that is as elusive and unknowable as that. Okay, so far so good. But there's another aspect to this. What about introspective consciousness? So far, I've just been talking about perceptual consciousness, about sensitivity to the world. What about introspective consciousness? Are non-human animals subject to the illusion of phenomenality, as we are? Well, if the illusion depends, as I've argued it does, on introspective mechanisms, then I think most won't be, because there's really little evidence for the existence of introspective capacities in creatures other than ourselves, with the exception of perhaps some other apes and perhaps some birds. Certain birds seem to display remarkable cognitive abilities. But with other animals, there's little or no evidence of introspection. Certainly not with our fish. Okay, so these creatures, the bulk of other animals will not be subject to the illusion of phenomenality. Okay, so what follows from that? Am I then saying that the experiences of these other animals are not like anything? If they don't have the illusion of phenomenality, it's not like anything to be them, and so am I just saying then that they're just biological machines, and that we shouldn't care about them? For many people, it seems that possession of phenomenal consciousness is what makes a creature's condition matter. And if I'm suggesting that not only that creatures don't have that most non-human animals not only don't have phenomenal consciousness, but don't even have the illusion of it, then that seems that would seem to suggest that I don't think their condition matters. Well, no, I don't think that. And briefly, here's why. Now, this is a complicated issue. There's a lot to be said. I won't try to get into it in detail here, but I'll just sketch the kind of response that I give to this kind of objection. It all turns on what we mean by like something. We talk about what it's like to be a creature, what a creature's experiences are like. I'm using experience here, by the way, in a functional sense, to refer to a brain state that performs a certain function, a state of perceptual sensitivity to the world or to the state of one's own body. So we ask the fish is is having an experience of some sort in this functional sense. It's registering the presence of damage to its body, and it's reacting to that. It's having an experience in that functional sense. But is that experience like something? And whether it or not it's like something seems to be the significant moral, ethical question. But this talk of like something, I think it's vague and unhelpful, and we need to sort out more carefully what we mean by it. So here are a couple of things that we might mean by it. For the phenomenal realist, saying that an experience is like something means that it has phenomenal properties. It has qualia. It has this phenomenal dimension to it. But there's another way we could understand it, and the way that the illusionist would want to understand it, and it's something like this. The experience has properties that would lead its possessor to believe it has phenomenal properties. if its possessor were to introspect it in the right kind of way, in the kind of way that we introspect our experiences, whatever that is. You might recall my earlier distinction between classic qualia and zero qualia. So here the first reading is that the experience has classic qualia, and the second reading that the experience has zero qualia. Zero qualia being properties that would dispose you to believe in the presence of classic qualia. So here are the two senses. An experience is like something if it really has this phenomenal dimension to it, and the second reading is that an experience is like something if it has features that would lead you to think that it has a phenomenal dimension if you were to introspect it. Okay, so let's see what, given these two readings, what illusionism says about the experiences of non-human animals, creatures without introspection, creatures that don't have the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. Remember, the objection is that the illusionist seems to be reintroducing a sharp distinction between us and those other creatures, that because most other creatures lack introspective capacities, they lack the sense of it being like anything to be them, and therefore their experiences don't matter. Let's see if that is true given these readings. Well, first, if we adopt reading 1, the realist reading, then from the illusionist perspective, no creature's experiences are like anything, not even ours. So it doesn't matter whether you have introspective capacities or not. In neither case are your experiences like anything in that sense. So there's no sharp distinction between us and other animals. As I say here, introspection, the illusionist claim isn't that introspection somehow creates phenomenal consciousness, that it actually gives our experiences phenomenal properties. No, it's merely that it fosters belief in the existence of phenomenal consciousness. It fosters belief in the belief that our experiences have phenomenal properties. Okay, so there's no sharp distinction there between us and other animals. Okay, so what about sense 2? Well, in this sense, the experiences of other animals, animals that lack introspective capacities, will still be like something, because they will still possess properties that would lead them to form the belief that they have phenomenal properties if they were able to introspect them. They still have those first-order properties that would cause the illusion of phenomenality, even though it's not actually causing it, that illusion in them, because they lack introspective capacities. But they've still got the experiences still have the features that ground that sense of phenomenality, even though they're not actually creating it. So, as I say here, other animals will have first-order experiences similar to ours, and maybe, obviously, there'll be a gradation of similarity, but we can assume that they have many similarities to ours, including at least some of the properties that create the sense of phenomenality. And if those creatures had had the ability to introspect them, then they would have formed similar beliefs about them to ours. So in this sense, again, there's no difference between us and them. So the moral then is that even if introspective consciousness were unique to humans, there'd still be no sharp difference between what the experiences of human and non-human animals are like. At least given these two definitions. Now, of course, you could come up with another definition here, another definition of what it means to say that an experience is like something, on which there is a sharp distinction. Maybe you could say that the obvious one would be that an experience is like something if it is actually being targeted by introspection and actually generating the belief that it is that it has phenomenal properties. And then, of course, no creature that doesn't have introspective capacities would have experiences that are like something in that sense, ones that are actually being targeted by introspection. But then it might follow that while some of our experiences are like something, most of them aren't. Unless you think that the introspective monitoring of our experiences is continuous, and that it's continually generating beliefs about the phenomenal character of our own experiences, then you'll conclude that most of our experiences aren't like anything either. So I guess we could go on arguing over definitions, but I'm not sure it would get us anywhere. What it is like talk is, I think, just inherently vague, and one of the main motivations for articulating illusionism is to try to put some pressure on it and cash out what it comes to. I don't think there's any pressure to develop it in a way that makes a sharp distinction between the experiences of us and those of other animals. So I don't think there's a serious problem here for illusionists. What there is, I think, though, is an indication that illusionists need to say more about the ethical implications of their view, and to address the worry that our ethical concerns are tied to phenomenal realism. And so that's what I'll do in the final section of this lecture. Let's look at that now. Implications for ethics. Now, I think it's fair to say that some people think that the implications of illusionism, the ethical implications of illusionism, are quite frankly terrible. So here's a quotation from Galen Strawson again. He says this. He's commenting on Dennett's view of consciousness, which is an illusionist one. He says, if Dennett's right, no one has ever really suffered, in spite of agonizing diseases, mental illness, murder, rape, famine, slavery, bereavement, torture, and genocide. And no one has ever caused anyone else pain. This is the great silliness. We must hope that it doesn't spread outside the academy or convince some future information technologist or roboticist who has great power over our lives. So there we are. The Strawson is claiming that if the illusionist is right, there's no suffering of any kind. I take it that what's behind this is that Strawson's assuming that when we talk about suffering and pain and so on, we are talking about phenomenal properties, about qualia, about what it is likeness of our experience, understood as some private mental quality that we're directly acquainted with. And since illusionists deny the reality of such properties, then they're denying the reality of suffering. Here's Dennett's response to that from that was in the New York Review of Books a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and here's Dennett's response from the next issue. He says, I don't deny the existence of consciousness. Of course, consciousness exists. It just isn't what most people think it is, as I've said many times. I do grant that Strawson expresses quite vividly a widespread conviction about what consciousness is. Might people, and Strawson in particular, be wrong about this? That's the issue. So what Dennett's saying here is that consciousness in general, and particular conscious states of pain and suffering and so on, aren't constituted by phenomenal properties, by qualia, by these private mental qualities we're directly acquainted with. He's not saying they're not real, he's saying they're not what Strawson thinks they are. So he's not denying the reality of suffering, he's saying that suffering is perfectly real, but it's not certainly what Strawson thinks it is, and what many other philosophers think it is. And of course, I agree with Dennett. Of course, I'm not denying that people suffer. We all know when we're suffering, and we know when other people are suffering. The question is, what's happening when we're suffering? Is it that there's some private mental awfulness that is directly presented to us, presented to our psyche? Or is it that we're in some highly complex state of sensitivity to our own bodily condition, which is provoking a host of psychological reactions, emotional, physiological, cognitive, volitional, and so on? that's the issue. Let's spell this out a little bit more by distinguishing two types of questions we can ask about conscious experience. We can ask questions about its value. Do pain and pleasure matter ethically? Yes, right. Pretty much everyone agrees on that, I suppose. Are they the only things that matter ethically, as hedonists think, like this Roman fellow with the glass of wine, and so on? There are many questions we can ask here. We can also ask questions about are pain and pleasure the only things that motivate us? Another form of hedonism. So we can ask questions about the value of conscious experience of pains, pleasure, and other kinds of conscious experience, of course. And secondly, we can ask questions about the nature of conscious experience. For example, are pain and pleasure wholly physical states? Are they just physical states of the brain, or do they have some non-physical aspect to them? Do they involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties? Does being in pain involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties? Strawson thinks that it does. Dennett and I think that it doesn't. And so on. Now here's the important point. We can address the value questions without first answering the nature questions. So we can all agree that pain matters ethically, that if you're in pain, that matters, and we should try to do something about it. We can all agree on that without answering the question, is the state that you're in a wholly physical one? Or does the state that you're in involve acquaintance with private pain qualia? We don't need to answer that question before we answer the first one. Indeed, we typically don't. I mean, most people have strong opinions about the value questions without having any strong opinions about the nature ones. People who aren't philosophers don't tend to worry about whether pain is a wholly physical state, but they know it's a bad state. Moreover, we can agree on the answers to the value questions while disagreeing on the answers to the nature questions. So I completely agree with Strawson that all of those things he mentioned matter. That they're terrible and that we should try to prevent them, and that anybody who brings them about is bringing about something bad. Of course, I just disagree with him about what those states actually involve. So, like Dennett, I reply to Strawson that I don't deny the existence of suffering or the badness of suffering. I just deny a certain view of what suffering is. To underline that point, illusionism, of course, is relevant only to the nature questions. It doesn't attempt to address the value questions. Now, at this point, the Strawson or someone who's sympathetic to his point might reply along the following lines. They might say, they might raise this objection. They might say that our answers to the value question do depend on our answer to the nature question. That the value we place on experience depends on our conception of what experience is. And that's to say the realist might propose a claim like this, a dependency claim, that we think that pains and pleasures matter ethically because we think that they involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties. We're motivated to care about pain and pleasure because we think that they involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties. And then if that's right, then persuading people to adopt illusionism and to believe that pain and pleasure don't involve acquaintance with the phenomenal properties would result in their concluding that pains and pleasure don't matter ethically, assuming that was that's the only reason that they think they matter ethically. So what would the illusionists say to this? There's a lot to be said here, but I'll just sketch some responses here. First, it's not at all clear, I think, that the dependency claim is true. I mean, I guess it's pretty much universally accepted that pains and pleasures matter ethically, but I don't think it's universally accepted that they involve acquaintance with phenomenal properties. I don't think most people base their ethical concern on this philosophical theory of the nature of experience. Indeed, I guess the pre-theoretical, the pre-philosophical, the common sense view is that that experiences don't involve acquaintance with private mental qualities. People, I guess the common sense view is that the colours and sounds and smells are out there in the world, that not in here in our minds. And similarly with pains, that if you stub your toe, the pain is in your toe, not in your mind. Of course, you can soon get people to revise that view by getting them to do some philosophy. But I think it's implausible to claim that philosophical view about the nature of experience is actually the one that grounds our concern for suffering generally. We think pains matter because we've been in pain and we know it's not a state we like to be in, and we care about other people's pain because we care for them and assume that they don't like to be in it either, in that sort of state either. So I don't think it's obvious that the dependency claim is true. Besides, even if it were true, accepting illusionism wouldn't require people to give up thinking that pains and pleasures matter ethically. It would merely require them to find some other grounds for thinking that they matter. They could still hang on to the idea that pain and pleasure matter. They just have to base that view on other considerations. They find better grounds for thinking that they matter. For example, we might think that pain matters because of its effects, because of what it does to you. I mean, remember the representational zombies who they still have the pain qualia, but it has no effects on them, and they're just perfectly calm and untroubled, with no bad thoughts, no bad emotional reactions, no signs of distress at all. Why should that form of why should that state matter? Indeed. On the other hand, consider the person who isn't having any pain qualia, but is having all the negative effects of pain. You know, who is showing all the signs of distress, or all the psychological distress associated with pain, or desperately wants it to stop. Isn't that a reason for isn't focusing on those effects a sufficient reason to think that the state matters? In fact, a better reason, given that the pure qualia itself, without the effects, would seem innocuous. And I think there are plenty of precedents for this kind of revision. I mean, think about belief in the soul. I mean, in the past, people thought that the value of human life depended on our possession of an immaterial soul. And so there could have believers in the soul might have proposed a similar dependency claim that human life matters because humans have an immaterial soul. And therefore, that anyone who proposed that we didn't have an immaterial soul was threatening to undermine the value of human life. But it turns out that we were able, many of us at least, were able to give up the idea that we have an immaterial soul without thereby giving up our belief that human life has value. So I don't find these worries very compelling. I think so long as we can all reliably identify suffering when we encounter it, either in ourselves or in others, and we can all agree that it's whatever it is, it's not good, then we're okay ethically. The philosophical questions are about the nature of suffering are another thing altogether. I'll just mention a reading here, a recent paper by Francois Camera, who is an illusionist, and he addresses this worry about the normative implications of illusionism, implications for ethics. He takes this challenge rather more seriously than I do, and he reviews the options for the illusionist in that paper. It's certainly one I'd recommend if you're interested in this, and it's a good place to start. Okay, so that's responding to the objection from the realist, the attack on illusionism, the ethical attack on illusionism. But I want to round off by actually going on the offensive a bit here, and suggesting that illusionism is actually has positive ethical implications. It doesn't just not undermine our ethical intuitions. It actually supports a rather more benign ethical position. Because again, the realist has a problem, I think, here, a problem in the ethical, in thinking about the ethics of consciousness, just as they have a problem thinking about artificial consciousness and about animal consciousness and so on. And it's again, of course, rooted in the fact that phenomenal properties would be private, subjective ones. And so the objection turns the dependency claim around against the realist. It goes like this: if it were the phenomenal properties of experience that makes experiences matter ethically, then we can't be sure which experiences matter. Because again, we can't infer phenomenal facts from public facts, from facts about brains and behaviour. There doesn't seem to be any reliable way of telling what it's like to be a creature simply from observing, or to be another human being simply from observing its behaviour or by studying its brain or whatever. The phenomenal facts are subjective ones, they're private ones. Again, we can only come to a conclusion about what it's like to be another person by making assumptions about correlations between the things we can observe, the public states we can observe, the behaviour and brain states and so on, and the private ones that are supposed to be the real source of ethical concern. And these assumptions might be wrong. This, of course, is the version of the problem of other minds. It could be that there's something very special about me that makes me phenomenally conscious, and that other people don't possess this special feature, and they're not. They're all zombies. And unless we can actually establish some explanatory connection between the publicly observable facts about a person and their phenomenal state, we can't ever be sure what their phenomenal life is like. Maybe other people's pain behaviour isn't accompanied by pain qualia, and hence, on the realist view, doesn't matter. I think the realist has to accept that that's at least a possibility, even if they don't think it's a likely one. So phenomenal realism opens the possibility of this rather alarming thought that it's only your own pains that hurt in the phenomenal sense, and so only your own pains that matter ethically. Of course, I'm not suggesting that phenomenal realists think that. I'm sure they will find that view appalling, but it's a possibility that their view allows, I think, and again, one that's at least as alarming, I think, as any of the consequences, as any of the supposed consequences of illusionism. So there's a little bit of the pot on the kettle about this debate, I think. So yes, realism threatens to make us skeptics about other people's suffering. Again, I think adopting an illusionist perspective is more attractive here. Let's start with this. Conscious experiences matter. And how they matter depends on what kind they are. But pains are bad, pleasures are good, and so on. The illusionists can say that without any equivocation. All that we need here is that we can all identify conscious experiences and different kinds of conscious experiences when they occur. We can identify them in ourselves. I started right at the beginning of these lectures saying that we have the ability to introspectively identify different kinds of experiences when they occur in us. That's uncontroversial from an illusionist perspective. Similarly, we have reliable ways of identifying experiences in other people, and their behaviour, and we're all agreed that the nature of people's experiences matter, and that the way they matter depends on what kind of experiences they are. Now, the illusionists will go on to say that different kinds of experiences are distinguished by their informational reactive role. That what experiences are complex informational reactive states of the brain, and that different kinds of experiences are distinguished by the nature of this informational reactive role. And now we're getting into the distinctively illusionist part of this. And the illusionist will add that all of the relevant facts about experience and about the nature of an experience are publicly detectable. At least with the right equipment. We might need to use brain scans and other apparatus in order to get all the fine detail. But it's all available in principle for us to... all the facts are in principle available to us about another person's experience, I mean. And the relevant facts are usually well revealed in behaviour, and except in cases where there's some the case of paralysis, for example, or cases perhaps where the person is trying hard to conceal their what they're experiencing. In normal conditions, the relevant facts are revealed well in behaviour, and even in the abnormal cases, they're in principle available to us. We would then need to start investigating the nature of the internal processes within their brains to see whether the usual whether the internal informational reactive processes characteristic of pain were occurring, pain or whatever other experience it might be. So on this view, there are no radically private facts about experience. There are no facts that are not in principle accessible to other people. And I think this has a benign consequence, an attractive consequence. And it's this: we're not each of us locked into a private mental world, completely sealed off from everyone else. What it's, to use this vague and often unhelpful phrase, what it's like to be me is not something that only I can know. What my experiences, the nature of my experiences, is not something that's revealed only to me privately. We're not each of us locked into a private mental world, a little Cartesian world, a little Cartesian theatre which only we can view. We're not sealed off from each other in that way. My experiences are part of this shared public world, and other people can, in principle, know everything about them if they attend. They can learn an awful lot by observing my behaviour and paying close attention to it, and they can learn even more by studying my nervous system, my central nervous system. So, in this view, we're all part of the same world. We don't inhabit private metaphysical worlds that are sealed off from each other, and we can, in principle, know everything about each other. To know whether someone else is suffering, we don't need to make assumptions about correlations between what we can observe and their own private mental world. We don't need to do philosophy in order to know whether people are suffering. We just need to observe them carefully. This isn't such a strange idea, I think. Think of a couple who have lived together for many years and care deeply for each other and have observed each other and have become exquisitely sensitive to each other, and who know in any situation what things the other person will be picking up on and how they will be reacting to it, what emotions they will be having, what memories will be they will be calling up, what thoughts and desires they will be having. In this case, really, they may know each other's minds as well as they know their own, perhaps even better, because they are so sensitive to the way the other person is engaged with the world, with the pattern of sensitivities and reactions that constitute their experience. So really, and in these cases there can be no doubt really about what the other person is feeling, because it's all there for the other to see. So again, we don't need to make assumptions about correlations between what we can see and the hidden mental reality. We just need to observe. We just need to look. So let's look. Okay, well, that's the end of this lecture and of this series of lectures on illusionism. I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope that I've managed to persuade you that illusionism isn't quite the silliest view that's ever been proposed, and might even be worth taking seriously. So this is the end of the lectures, but I hope it's not the end of your interest in illusionism, and I hope that some of you will go on to think about illusionism for yourself and perhaps contribute to developing illusionist theories of consciousness. I'm convinced that it's the way forward, and I hope some of you will join us on this journey. So, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye for now.